This isn't just a recording. It's a ghost made of sound, trapped on wax. We found it buried deep, a corrupted echo of London's darkest hour, and it whispers a name Scotland Yard tried to forget: Jack the Ripper. They say his reign of terror ended, but this cylinder tells a different story. A story of a final victim, a woman lost to the fog of Whitechapel, whose last moments were not simply taken, but twisted into something far more horrifying. This is not the official record. This is what was left behind when the gas lamps flickered and the shadows grew long. What they missed, what they buried. We're pulling it back into the light, or rather, into the dim glow of a single lantern, because the truth, even after a century, still has a voice. And this one screams. London, 1888. A city perpetually cloaked in a deep, suffocating twilight. The infamous London fog wasn't merely a meteorological inconvenience, it was a living shroud, an ever-present entity that clung to the narrow, winding, cobbled streets of Whitechapel, muffling the desperate cries, the panicked gasps, and the very sounds of life itself, all under its suffocating, unyielding blanket. The air was a potent, oppressive cocktail, a thick mixture of biting coal smoke, the cloying dampness of the Thames, and the pervasive, ever-present undercurrent of raw desperation that seeped from the very stones of the district. In this bewildering, disorienting labyrinth of tightly packed streets and treacherous shadowed alleyways, a phantom stalked with chilling impunity, leaving behind a horrifying, undeniable trail of unspeakable carnage. Scotland Yard, battered and overwhelmed by the relentless pressure from an increasingly agitated public and the stern demands of the Crown, made the fateful decision to declare the Ripper case officially closed. They issued pronouncements of the end of the terror, the successful capture of the monstrous beast, or at least a satisfactory and conclusive cessation of his horrific atrocities. The vast majority of the city's newspapers, eager to herald the return to normalcy, proclaimed the imminent banishment of the monster, and a collective, albeit still trembling, sigh of relief rippled through the populace. Yet, in the quiet, forgotten corners of neglected archives, within the dusty, decaying boxes of evidence that had been deemed too insignificant, too bizarre, or too unsettling for the official record, history, much like a persistent, hacking cough that refuses to be silenced, always finds a way to resurface, to assert its undeniable presence. And sometimes this resurfacing does not manifest on fragile paper, but on these brittle, easily degraded discs of wax, mediums that whisper secrets from a lost world. This particular cylinder, remarkably unearthed from a forgotten dusty archive, was initially catalogued with a sterile, uninteresting designation, a simple domestic recording. Perhaps a fleeting snippet of a woman's voice, a brief, unremarkable account of her day, or even a message intended for a distant loved one. But something profoundly disturbing and fundamentally altering occurred during its creation, an event that irrevocably warped and corrupted its very nature. The recording itself is fractured, distorted beyond all recognition, as if the very act of capturing these final, unspeakable moments had corrupted the medium itself, twisting the innocent, almost sacred act of preservation into a tangible artifact of pure, unadulterated terror. It's akin to peering into a shattered mirror, its fragments reflecting a distorted, broken reality, a reality warped and shattered by something that lies far beyond our current human comprehension, something that seems to possess an unnatural ability to infect and corrupt reality itself. Even now, the very air surrounding this cylinder seems to crackle with an almost palpable residual horror, a chilling echo of the events it so faithfully, so terrifyingly contains.
The woman whose final moments are etched into this wax, her name painstakingly pieced together from faint, almost illegible inscriptions found on the cylinder's tarnished, weathered tin casing, was identified as Eliza Croft. A seamstress by trade, she lived a life of quiet, unassuming simplicity, confined to a cramped, barely habitable room situated on one of Whitechapel's many forgotten, winding, and notoriously disorienting alleys. Her days were meticulously measured by the relentless, monotonous whir of her sewing machine, the constant, gnawing ache in her overworked fingers, and the flickering, unsteady glow of her meager oil lamp, a solitary beacon in her darkened world. She was not a figure of public notoriety, not a fallen woman of the night, not a frequent patron of the very elements that defined the Ripper's predatory hunting grounds. She was not a denizen of the infamous streets that whispered of vice, of depravity, and of utter despair. Eliza was simply Eliza, a solitary shadow among countless other shadows, her existence a quiet, uneventful passage spent in the relentless struggle to survive the unyielding grip of crushing poverty and the ever-present, bone-chilling damp of a city that seemed determined to swallow any glimmer of hope whole. Yet, her final recorded words, the precious fragmented pieces that we managed to meticulously clean and significantly amplify through hours of painstaking, delicate work, paint a chilling picture of terror that stretches far beyond the simple, brutal act of a slashing knife or the tragic spilling of innocent blood. We can distinctly hear her breath, ragged and alarmingly shallow, each tiny inhalation a desperate, almost unconscious gasp for life itself, a chilling prelude to the unimaginable horrors that were about to irrevocably unfold. Then a sound emerges, a sound that chills you to the very core of your being, a sound that defies all natural explanation. It begins as a sharp gasp, a choked, desperate cry, the primal, instinctive urge to scream for help that is inherent in all living creatures, but it morphs, it twists, it contorts into something guttural, something that does not sound entirely recognizably human. It is a sound that seems to scrape against the very fabric of reality, a vocalization of pure, unadulterated terror, so profound, so overwhelming that it seems to alter its own very nature, transforming a simple human cry into something alien, something utterly monstrous and deeply unsettling. What unimaginable terror could possibly contort a human voice into such a horrifying sound, stripping away its very humanity and leaving behind only raw primal fear? The sheer quality of the sound itself is unlike anything naturally occurring, something that resonates with a primal, unsettling frequency, a frequency that suggests an encounter with something fundamentally other. As we embark on the arduous process of cleaning and amplifying the audio, painstakingly filtering out the incessant hissing static, the subtle, intrusive clicks of degradation inherent in the old recording medium, and the pervasive, almost omnipresent hum of the machinery itself, fragments of Eliza's final thoughts, her last sensory experiences, begin to emerge from the suffocating, impenetrable murk of the corrupted recording. She speaks, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper against the encroaching, palpable dread of a presence. Not merely a man, not just another predator lurking in the dimly lit, fog-choked streets of Whitechapel, but a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the deeper, older, more ancient darkness that permeated the very essence of the district. she mentions a profound, unnatural, invasive cold, a chill that seeped into her very bones, a cold so intense that no amount of physical exertion, no amount of huddled warmth from her meager, sputtering fire could ever hope to dispel, even within the confines of her small, barely functional room, crammed with the meager, threadbare comforts of her solitary existence.
She whispers, her voice barely audible, of eyes that were not fashioned from flesh and blood, but from something ancient, something vast and impossibly hungry. Eyes that watched her from the deepest corners of her vision, from the spaces between the deepening shadows that clung malevolently to her walls. These are not the terrified, yet ultimately understandable pronouncements of a victim facing a common, albeit brutal, killer. These are the desperate, fragmented, and chilling recollections of someone confronting a force that defies all known explanation, a force that seems to operate on a different plane of existence entirely, a realm far beyond our own. It's as if the very air around her grew teeth, and the encroaching darkness itself began to breathe, to stalk, to hunt her with a terrifying, malevolent sentience. What kind of ultimate terror grips a soul when the very environment, the very air one breathes, becomes an active, terrifying participant in the torment? Do you believe Eliza was hallucinating from fear, or was she truly sensing something that defies rational explanation, something from a world unseen? Sherlock Holmes, ever the steadfast pragmatist, ever rigidly tethered to the observable and the strictly logical, initially dismissed the more outlandish interpretations of Eliza's fragmented vocalizations. He spoke eloquently of mass hysteria, a common affliction that often gripped populations during times of great fear and overwhelming uncertainty, of the profound psychological toll that living under constant, unrelenting threat in such a dangerous, unforgiving district could inflict, and of the mind's insidious tendency to conjure terrifying phantoms when the body is weak and the spirit is irrevocably frayed. He theorized about the debilitating effects of extreme exhaustion and the mind's natural inclination to fill in the terrifying gaps in perception with the most horrifying imaginations. But even he, with his renowned, almost superhuman intellect and his uncanny ability to dissect truth from even the most convoluted falsehood, to find the single, logical thread in the most tangled and impenetrable of webs, found himself staring intently at the complex, undulating waveforms displayed on the playback machine, his brow deeply furrowed in profound concentration, desperately searching for a logical, a scientific, a rational explanation for the impossible, unnatural sounds emanating from the fragile wax cylinder. His meticulous, precise notes, scribbled in the margins of spectral analysis reports and detailed sonic diagrams, began to betray a subtle, almost imperceptible hint of unease, a barely perceptible crack in his otherwise unshakable, formidable composure. A quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement that this particular piece of evidence challenged the very foundations of his analytical framework, pushing the boundaries of his deductive reasoning. Dr. Watson, always the keen observer and chronicler of human emotion, always the one to feel the subtle pulse of fear and despair that seeped from the city's shadowed underbelly, felt a familiar yet alarmingly amplified sense of dread settling deep within his own gut, a chilling premonition that this was not a case that could be solved with simple logic and deduction alone, not a puzzle with a straightforward, rational solution. This felt like touching something ancient and forbidden that should have remained buried deep, a secret that the very earth itself seemed to be trying desperately to keep hidden, a wound that refused to heal, festering silently in the suffocating darkness of history. The cylinder, precious and terrifying in equal, terrifying measure, offers a few more tantalizing yet deeply unsettling clues that begin to weave a complex tapestry of dread and mystery. Eliza, in her fading, desperate moments, mentions a specific rhyme, a forgotten lullaby her mother used to sing to her in the innocence of her childhood, a simple nursery tune that spoke of the weaver of nightmares and the threads of the night. She repeats these ancient words, her voice a fragile whisper against the encroaching, palpable dread, as if the words themselves held some forgotten, potent power. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, as if the entity she was facing recognized them, drawing a sinister strength from their ancient invocation. This is not the Ripper of the lurid penny dreadfuls, not the sensationalized figure dissected and sensationalized in the yellow press, not the subject of morbid fascination and wildly exaggerated terror that gripped the city. This is something else entirely, something far more primal, something that draws its power from older, deeper, more fundamental fears, from the very essence of human dread that lurks within the collective unconscious of mankind, a fear as old and as deeply ingrained as humanity itself. Could the Ripper's terrifying, infamous legend, his widely known moniker, be nothing more than a convenient, carefully constructed mask for a far more ancient, far more insidious threat, one that has plagued humanity for millennia, lurking in the dark, forgotten corners of the world, feeding on fear and despair? The very concept begins to fray the edges of what we believe to be true about the Ripper's brutal, bloody legacy, suggesting a far more complex and horrifying truth lies hidden beneath the surface. And then the final chilling moments captured on the wax come to light. The fragmented, terrifying sounds of Eliza's escalating terror, the desperate gasps and the unnatural alien vocalizations abruptly, unnervingly cease. There is no final struggle, no desperate, blood-curdling scream for help, no final pleading cry. Instead, a profound, unnerving stillness descends, a deep, pervasive quiet that is infinitely more terrifying, more unsettling than any scream could ever hope to be. The distorted, unnatural vocalizations vanish completely, replaced by a low, deeply resonating hum, a deep, throbbing vibration that seems to emanate not from the immediate room where Eliza met her horrific end, but from the very air itself, from the very fabric of reality. It's like the low thrum of a vast celestial engine, or perhaps, more chillingly, the slow sigh of something immense and immeasurable awakening from a long, deep slumber, stirred by the terrible events unfolding around it. It's a sound that seems to vibrate not just in your ears, but in your very soul, a final echoing confirmation of what Eliza Truth truly encountered in those final unspeakable moments, a chilling testament to the unnatural, alien force she faced. It's a sound that leaves you with a single, chilling question echoing in the silence. If the Ripper's terrifying reign of terror was merely the opening act, a preliminary display of dread for something far grander, far more horrific, playing out in the hidden, unseen theatre of London's deepest, darkest shadows, then what truly lies in wait for us in the encroaching darkness? This single fragile cylinder, this fragile fragment of a lost, tragic life has opened a door to a history we never knew existed, a history whispered in the dark, a history waiting to be unearthed.
What do you believe Eliza Croft truly encountered in her final moments? Was the Ripper himself merely a pawn, or did he simply pave the way for something far older and more sinister to emerge from the shadows? Share your most chilling theories with us in the comments below. If this unnerving glimpse into London's forgotten, hidden horror sent a shiver down your spine, please hit that like button and let us know. And for more journeys into London's deepest, darkest secrets, into the cases Scotland Yard simply couldn't solve, make sure you're subscribed. The whispers from the wax are growing louder, and we're compelled to listen. The chilling hum that concluded our last segment lingers, a low, resonant vibration that seems to sink into the very bone marrow, a disquieting echo of something vast and awakening. We continue our painstaking work, meticulously cleaning the corrupted wax cylinder, a delicate operation, a surgical procedure performed on history itself, a process requiring the utmost precision and unwavering patience. Each tiny speck of grime, each microscopic fracture on the brittle wax is a potential clue, a breadcrumb leading us deeper into Eliza Croft's final, terrifying moments, a desperate attempt to piece together the shattered remnants of her last experiences. The whirring of the phonograph, once a source of fascination and academic curiosity, now sounds like a frantic heartbeat against the growing silence, a pulse in the cold, vast darkness we are unearthing. We're not just playing back a sound recording, we're trying to reconstruct a soul's final desperate unraveling, to give voice back to someone whose voice was stolen in the most horrific manner imaginable, leaving behind only fragments of dread and the unsettling whisper of ancient alien tongues. As we apply specialized cleaning solutions, gentle, impossibly fine brushes, and carefully controlled heat, the pervasive background noise begins to recede, slowly, almost reluctantly. The incessant hiss, a constant, irritating companion to these aged recordings, a sonic shroud that has masked so many whispers from the past, slowly gives way to something more coherent, yet infinitely more disturbing. The sounds that emerge are not mere vocalizations, they are fragments of a fractured consciousness, chilling glimpses into a mind grappling with a terror beyond human comprehension, a terror that seems to have fundamentally altered the very nature of reality around her. Eliza's initial whispers, once almost completely swallowed by static, now reveal themselves as desperate attempts to articulate the inexpressible, to convey a horror that transcends mere words. She speaks of the cold, not as a physical sensation, a mere drop in temperature, but as a creeping dread that seeped into her very being, a sentient chill that predated the Ripper's physical presence, an internal frost that seemed to emanate from the very shadows of her small, sparsely furnished room. She describes it as a visiting dampness, a feeling that wasn't merely on her skin, but within her bones, a pervasive internal frost that no amount of huddled warmth, no amount of clutching her thin shawl could ever hope to dispel, even within the confines of her meager, barely functioning hearth. This is a detail that immediately sets her experience apart from the accounts of the Ripper's known victims. They spoke of fear, of violence, of the shock of the attack, but rarely of a supernatural, all-consuming cold that seemed to precede and surround the horrific acts. It suggests an encounter with something that did not merely kill, but corroded, an entity that brought its own chilling realm with it, a localized pocket of absolute negation, a touch from the void itself.
Then we hear her voice, strained and thin, barely a whisper against the encroaching, palpable dread, repeating the fragmented phrases, the ones that hint at something ancient and primal, something from the very fabric of forgotten nightmares.
"The weaver, the threads, they're pulling," she murmurs, her voice a fragile thread herself, fraying under an unimaginable strain, as if the very act of speaking was causing her essence to unravel, her very existence to fray at the edges. She mentions the oppressive darkness in her room, a darkness that felt different from the usual comforting shadows cast by her sputtering oil lamp, a familiar darkness that offered a semblance of safety and the illusion of safety. This darkness, she claims, had a weight, a density, as if it were a physical entity pressing in on her, suffocating her, stealing the very air from her lungs, making each breath a desperate, shallow struggle. She whispers about eyes, not the eyes of a man, not the glint of human malice or predatory intent, but ancient eyes, vast and hungry, watching her from the corners of her vision, from the spaces between the deepening shadows that clung malevolently to her walls, from the periphery of her very perception, existing just beyond the threshold of conscious awareness. These are not the pronouncements of a woman terrified of a human assailant, of a visceral, earthly threat. These are the fearful, fractured memories of someone confronting a force that defies rational explanation, a force that seems to operate on an entirely different plane of existence, a realm far beyond our own comprehension, a reality governed by alien physics and unfathomable intentions. It's as if the very fabric of reality around her was being stretched and distorted by an unseen, malevolent presence, a cosmic distortion of the mundane, turning the familiar into the terrifyingly alien. What could induce such a profound sense of alien observation, turning the familiar confines of a room into a stage for cosmic horror? What kind of entity would manifest not with physical force, but with an assault on perception itself, an invasion of the very senses, a psychological siege waged through sight and shadow? Sherlock Holmes, though his face remains impassive, his keen eyes fixed on the oscillating waveforms dancing on the monitor, is visibly engrossed, his usual detached analytical gaze now tinged with a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent of unease. His fingers, usually so precise and economical in their movements when taking notes, pause for a fraction of a second before continuing their frantic scribbling, betraying a flicker of internal deliberation, a momentary wrestling with the data. He mutters about unusual acoustic anomalies, about the possibility of resonant frequencies that could mimic auditory hallucinations, about the mind's capacity for self-deception under extreme duress, especially in the suffocating atmosphere of Whitechapel. But even his voice carries a note of uncertainty, a hint that the scientific explanations he offers are perhaps becoming less convincing even to himself as the evidence defies categorization. He points to a particularly sharp, discordant spike on the graph, a sonic anomaly that doesn't correspond to any known human vocalization, any environmental sound, or any recognizable terrestrial phenomenon.
This, he states, his voice low and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos captured on the recording, is not the sound of a scream. It is something else, a rupture in the natural order of sound, a distortion born not of distress, but of fundamental otherness. Dr. Watson, observing Holmes's subtle reactions and listening intently to the disembodied voice from the past, feels a familiar chill, a premonition of danger, but this one is amplified, deeper, more pervasive.
He feels like an interloper, a witness to a crime that transcends the physical, a violation of the very laws of nature, a glimpse into a reality that exists just beyond the veil of our everyday experience, a reality that makes the fog-choked alleys of Whitechapel seem benign by comparison. The air in their Baker Street rooms, usually filled with the comforting scent of tobacco and old books, seems to grow heavy, laden with an unseen, palpable dread, as if the oppressive atmosphere of Whitechapel itself has seeped through the very walls, carrying with it the chilling residue of Eliza's final moments. The fragments continued to spill forth from the cylinder, painting a picture that grows increasingly disturbing, more horrific with each passing moment, solidifying the growing unease. Eliza mentions a peculiar symbol, one she recalled from her childhood, a mark whispered about in hushed tones by her superstitious mother, a forgotten family heirloom of fear and admonition. It's a spiral, she describes, not a simple geometric shape found in textbooks or decorative art, but one that seems to writhe and shift under her gaze, drawing the eye inward with an unsettling, hypnotic quality, a symbol of endless descent, a visual representation of madness or oblivion, a vortex of unmaking. She repeats a phrase, a nonsensical string of syllables that sound like a forgotten language, a primitive incantation that seems to resonate with an unsettling power, a direct, if desperate, communication with the entity itself. Ka'ath, Zair, Tun. These words, uttered in her final moments, seem to hold a chilling significance, a key to unlocking the mystery, or perhaps a direct communication with the entity itself. Holmes, ever the scholar of the arcane and the unusual, his mind a vast repository of obscure knowledge, pores over ancient texts, his brow furrowed in deep contemplation, his fingers tracing lines of faded script, searching for any trace of this forgotten tongue, any connection to the obscure folklore of London's underbelly, the hidden traditions that fester beneath the city's veneer of respectability and order. He's not just investigating a murder, he's delving into a forgotten mythology, a hidden history that the city has tried to bury beneath its fog and its progress, a history that whispers of things that should have remained dormant, of powers that should have slept undisturbed. He consults dusty tomes on ancient cults and ancient rites, seeking a pattern, a linguistic anchor for the unspeakable. He finds a correlation, a fleeting mention in a text concerning ancient Babylonian rituals of a chant used to ward off entities from the void, a sequence of sounds intended to invoke a protective barrier. The implications are staggering. Eliza was not simply encountering a killer, she was facing something that required ancient, ritualistic countermeasures, something so alien that it predated the very concept of human civilization, suggesting a cosmic horror that has been lurking in the periphery of existence for millennia. Would you, armed with such cryptic warnings, dare to pronounce such words aloud? Or would you fear waking the slumbering dread they represent?
As we meticulously clean the cylinder further, Eliza's narrative takes a darker, more concrete turn, moving from subjective sensations to perceived physical manifestation, from atmospheric dread to tangible horror. She speaks of a presence that materialized not through a door or a window, not by any conventional means of ingress, but from the very air, coalescing from the oppressive darkness that she had previously described, as if the shadows themselves gained sentience and substance. She describes a form, indistinct yet terrifying, a silhouette that seemed to absorb the meager light, a void given shape,
a negative space given terrifying form, something that felt both present and utterly absent. She recounts a chilling sensation, not of being touched by a hand, not of the rough embrace of a human assailant, but of being penetrated by a cold, insidious force, as if something alien was reaching inside her, unraveling her very essence, touching her on a fundamental, cellular level, violating her very being. The previously described ancient eyes are now spoken of with a terrifying lucidity, eyes that promised not death, but absorption, a dissolution into something vast and uncaring, a complete erasure of self, a horrifying merging with the consuming darkness. Her fear is palpable, not just of physical pain, the agony of the Ripper's known methods, but of an existential horror, the fear of ceasing to be, of being consumed by something that existed beyond life and death, something that had no place for her in its alien understanding of existence, an entity that viewed consciousness as a consumable resource. This is far from the crude violence attributed to the Ripper. This suggests a ritual, a sacrifice, a feeding upon the very soul, an act of cosmic consumption that reduces a human life to a mere spark to be extinguished. The specific, almost guttural clicking sounds are now more pronounced, suggesting a non-human physiology attempting communication or expression, like the chittering of insects amplified to the size of boulders, or the grinding of tectonic plates. We also discern a new element, a low, rhythmic scraping, as if something impossibly large yet impossibly delicate was being drawn across stone, or perhaps across the very fabric of time itself. This sound, coupled with the clicking, suggests a form of sensory input and output that is utterly alien, a language spoken not with lungs and vocal cords, but with something else entirely. It paints a picture of an encounter that is not merely violent, but fundamentally transmutative, an experience that reconfigures Eliza's reality and perhaps her very existence at a subatomic level. The implications are profound. This entity doesn't just end lives, it potentially repurposes them, assimilating their essence into its own alien purpose. The audio culminates in a series of sounds that defy any reasonable explanation, a sonic landscape that warps and contorts the very concept of sound itself, pushing it beyond the boundaries of human auditory experience. The rupture Holmes identified earlier occurs again, more intense this time, a violent tear in the audio fabric, followed by a low, resonant frequency that vibrates through the playback equipment, a sound that feels ancient and wrong, a fundamental dissonance that grates against the very nerves. Eliza's voice, if it can be still called that, is lost in this overwhelming sonic tapestry, replaced by a series of guttural clicks that seem impossibly deep, and a sound that can only describe as a colossal, echoing sigh, a sound that suggests the slow, deliberate unfurling of immense, unseen wings, or perhaps the exhalation of a sleeping titan stirring in its eons-long slumber. And then silence. A profound, absolute silence that is more terrifying than any scream. A void where sound itself seemed to have been extinguished, not merely ceased, but actively removed. What was this unspeakable entity that could induce such terror, and could even corrupt the very sound waves that tried to capture its monstrous nature, leaving behind only fractured echoes of its passage? Do you think Eliza was merely a victim of a deranged mind, or did she stumble upon something far older, something that truly lurks in the deepest, most forgotten shadows of this ancient city, a presence that has lain dormant for centuries, an entity that has perhaps influenced human history in ways we cannot even begin to fathom. The evidence is mounting, each fragment of sound a piece of a terrifying mosaic that suggests the Ripper's gruesome work was but a prelude, a mere curtain raiser for a far older, far more terrifying entity that feasts on the very essence of humanity, on fear and despair itself. The whispers of the weaver of nightmares, the echoes of ancient words, the unnatural cold, and the profound existential dread all point to a conspiracy far beyond the grasp of Scotland Yard, a network of influence that operates in the deepest, darkest corners of existence. The next recording we examine promises to shed even more light, to pull back the veil further, but we must tread carefully. The resonance of Eliza's final moments clings to us, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that lie just beyond our perception, waiting for the slightest crack in our reality to seep through. If this unnerving journey into London's hidden history has captured your imagination and sent a shiver down your spine, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sherlock After Midnight. The whispers from the wax are growing louder, and we are compelled to listen. Sherlock Holmes, his face a mask of intense, almost feverish concentration, hunched over a collection of aged maps and obscure treatises spread across his study. The air in 221B Baker Street, usually a sanctuary of quiet deduction, now felt charged with an almost electric anticipation, a palpable hum mirroring the unsettling resonance from Eliza Croft's corrupted wax cylinder. He had been lost in these dusty tomes for days, fueled by black coffee and an insatiable, almost obsessive need to connect the fragmented whispers of the past to a tangible, comprehensible truth. The mention of the spiral symbol, the unsettling, almost alien chanting, and the pervasive, unnatural cold, these were not the hallmarks of a common murderer. They spoke of something far older, something deeply embedded in the forgotten folklore of London, a subterranean current of belief that ran beneath the city's polished surface, influencing its darkest hours. He was no longer merely investigating a series of brutal murders. He was peering into the very abyss of human history, unearthing a conspiracy so ancient and pervasive that it threatened to rewrite everything they understood about the world. The Ripper, once a terrifying figure of flesh and blood, was slowly morphing in his mind into something far more abstract, a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive dread that had always lurked in the city's forgotten corners, a lurking darkness that had perhaps guided the Ripper's bloody hand.
He had begun to draw parallels, faint at first, but growing stronger with each page turned, between Eliza's terrifying experience and ancient tales of entities that fed not on flesh, but on fear itself. Entities that could manipulate perception, warp reality, and drain the very life force from their victims. He cross-referenced local legends from Whitechapel, whispered superstitions passed down through generations, with accounts of similar phenomena from other cultures and eras. A recurring motif emerged, a weaver or a spinner of nightmares, a being associated with the fraying of reality, with the drawing of threads that led to oblivion. He found references to such beings in texts pertaining to pre-Roman British cults, shadowy organizations that worshipped forces beyond human understanding, forces that thrived in places where the veil between worlds grew thin. These were not mere myths, they were warnings, coded messages from a past that had witnessed and perhaps even communed with these terrifying entities. Holmes theorized that the Ripper's notoriety, his chilling efficiency, might have been a deliberate or perhaps unwitting facade,
a distraction from a far more ancient and pervasive evil that had been dormant for centuries, stirring in the shadows, its influence subtly shaping the city's grim destiny. He found a passage in a forgotten grimoire detailing a ritualistic hunt where the very shadows of a place were said to coalesce to form a predatory silhouette that fed on the terror of its prey, leaving behind only a hollowed echo. This echoed Eliza's description of a darkness that had weight and substance, a malevolent sentience that could detach itself from the walls, a terrifying manifestation of the void made corporeal. The intricate diagrams within the text depicted a cyclical relationship between the entity and human fear, a symbiotic horror that thrived on the city's collective dread. He pointed to a passage in a particularly fragile, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The ink seemed to bleed into the paper, as if it's still carrying some residual potent energy. "Watson," he said, his voice low and resonant, a tremor of something akin to awe or perhaps dread in its tone. "Consider this. For centuries, whispers have persisted of a hidden society known only as the Children of the Loom. They believed that reality itself was a tapestry woven from the threads of human emotion, and that certain beings could manipulate these threads, unraveling existence itself. They spoke of a great weaver, an entity that existed beyond the physical, whose touch could unravel not just fabric, but the very essence of a soul. Their rituals often involved the sacrifice of individuals whose threads were particularly vibrant, whose fear and despair could fuel the weaver's power." He tapped a section of text that described the entity's resonant song, a vibration that could unmake. This resonated deeply with the low hum they had heard from Eliza's cylinder, and the chilling, ambient drone detected at the scene of her demise, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the ears, but in the very soul, a fundamental dissonance that suggested a force capable of unmaking reality itself. The text described specific atmospheric conditions that facilitated the weaver's influence, periods of intense fog, prolonged darkness, and a heightened sense of collective anxiety. It seemed Whitechapel in 1888, in its fog-choked misery, had been the perfect hunting ground for such an ancient, insidious force. Driven by an overwhelming urge to see if these ancient whispers held any physical truth, Holmes decided they must visit the district where Eliza Croft had met her horrific end. They ventured out under the cloak of a moonless night, the familiar, oppressive fog of Whitechapel wrapping around them like a damp, chilling shroud, muffling their footsteps and distorting the very shapes of the narrow, winding streets. The gas lamps cast feeble, flickering pools of light, which only served to deepen the surrounding darkness, making every shadow seem alive, every corner a potential hiding place. They navigated the labyrinthine alleys, the air thick with the stench of coal smoke, damp earth, and a nameless, pervasive decay. It was a physical manifestation of the city's moral rot, a tangible representation of the despair that fueled the ancient evil. Holmes led them to a forgotten, disused cul-de-sac, a place so choked with neglect and shadow that it seemed to have been deliberately erased from the city's memory. At its dead end stood a small, crumbling brick structure, little more than a skeletal ruin, rumored to have once been an abandoned chapelry, or perhaps something far older, a place of forgotten rites, a forgotten node in the city's undercurrent. The local whispers spoke of the building with a peculiar dread, as if even its name had been cursed, a place where the veil between worlds was said to be perilously thin, a nexus point for the city's hidden malevolence. The silence here was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, pregnant stillness that felt as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. As they cautiously approached the decaying edifice, a faint, almost imperceptible humming filled the air, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building, a sound that pricked at their nerves and stirred a primal unease within them. It was the same low frequency detected on the wax cylinder, amplified by the very architecture of this forgotten place. The air here felt palpably colder, a biting, unnatural chill that seeped into their bones, far more profound than the ambient dampness of the Whitechapel fog. It was a cold that spoke not of winter, but of absence, of a place where warmth itself feared to tread, a chilling void that promised to strip away all life, all vitality. Holmes produced a small, brass-plated lantern, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch like living things across the crumbling facade. He carefully pushed open the rotted, half-off-its-hinges door, revealing an interior swallowed by darkness and the lingering scent of something ancient and decayed, a scent that was not merely dust and mildew, but something more primal, like the breath of a tomb that had been sealed for millennia, a phantom exhalation from the deep past. The structural integrity of the building seemed to defy logic. The stones appeared to be subtly shifting, reforming, as if responding to an unseen architect. Inside, amidst the rubble and the cobwebs, Holmes's lantern beam fell upon a chilling discovery. Etched into the damp, moss-covered stone floor was a large, intricate spiral symbol, identical to the one depicted in the ancient text, its lines seeming to possess a strange, three-dimensional depth, as if they were not merely carved, but somehow imprinted into the stone, almost as if the very material had been melted and reshaped by an unseen force, a dimensional alteration of the very substance of the building. The spiral seemed to draw the eye inwards, creating a disorienting, dizzying effect, a visual vortex pulling the observer into its depths. And at the very center of the spiral lay a small, tarnished silver locket, intricately engraved with the same winding motif, pulsing with a faint internal luminescence that seemed to defy the surrounding darkness, a tiny beacon of captured light in the encroaching gloom. Holmes carefully picked it up, his gloved fingers brushing away a century of dust. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been plucked from the depths of a frozen sea, the cold emanating from it almost painful to the touch, a localized pocket of absolute negation. When he managed to pry it open, they found not a portrait, but a single dried and impossibly preserved blossom, its petals the color of dried blood, its fragility a stark contrast to the oppressive ancient aura of the place. It seemed too delicate, too mundane a detail for such a profound horror. Yet, as Holmes held it, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread from the petals, a fleeting pulse of life, suggesting an unnatural resilience, a connection to a force that defied the natural decay of time and matter. The blossom itself seemed to subtly twist, its form shifting in the lantern light, as if caught in an unseen current. What does it mean for a single, fragile object to possess such an unnatural tenacity, to hold within it a spark of life that defies the very concept of decay and oblivion? This, Holmes stated, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and profound apprehension, this is not the work of a madman driven by earthly desires. This is the mark of something that has been here, lurking, influencing for an age. The children of the loom, the great weaver, these were not mere metaphors. They were attempts to describe a fundamental force, a malevolent consciousness that has woven itself into the very fabric of this city, and perhaps into the very fabric of existence itself. Eliza Croft was not merely murdered, she was unraveled. The chilling implications began to solidify. The fear that had been a whisper, now growing into a deafening roar. Eliza's last moments, the alien sounds, the unnatural cold, were not the ravings of a terrified victim, but the dying testament of someone who had been consumed, absorbed by a cosmic entity that existed beyond the realm of human understanding. A being that was perhaps the true ancient occupant of Whitechapel's deepest shadows.
The Ripper himself, Holmes mused, might have been merely a conduit, a pawn controlled by this ancient force, or perhaps, even more disturbingly, had become a vessel, his consciousness subsumed by something alien and malevolent. The threads of his own sanity and morality irrevocably unraveled. The Great Weaver might not just be a destructive force, it could be an entity that seeks to reshape reality according to its own unfathomable design. What does it mean for us, for our own reality, if our deepest fears are not just psychological states, but potential nourishment for something ancient and hungry? The very stones beneath their feet seemed to hum with a resonant malevolence, a silent acknowledgement of the entity's enduring presence. The echoes of Eliza Croft's final moments, the unnatural hum, and the chilling presence within that forgotten structure lingered long after they returned to the relative safety of Baker Street. Holmes, his mind a whirlwind of ancient lore and scientific deduction, now wrestled with a terrifying new hypothesis, that the Ripper killings were not random acts of violence, but a series of ritualistic sacrifices, meticulously orchestrated to feed or appease a far older, far more sinister entity. The corrupted wax cylinder was not just a recording of a murder, it was a captured echo, an imprint of this entity's terrifying power, a resonance that could potentially infect or influence others, a chilling testament to its enduring, unfathomable nature. Holmes believed that the Ripper himself may have been merely a conduit, a puppet controlled by this ancient force, or perhaps, even more disturbingly, had become a vessel, his consciousness subsumed by something alien and malevolent. The threads of his own sanity and morality irrevocably unraveled. The last cry on the wax was not simply the sound of a human's terror, but the precise moment this entity fully manifested, absorbing Eliza's very essence, leaving behind only a corrupted imprint on the fragile wax, a psychic scar etched into the medium. There would be no grand arrest, no neat resolution. The nature of this threat was too profound, too ancient to be contained by the conventional laws of man or justice. They were dealing with forces that transcended the physical, entities that fed on the very darkness that London and perhaps the world seemed so eager to ignore. The city, it seemed, was a fertile ground, its deep-seated fears and hidden vices providing sustenance for something that had been waiting for centuries, patiently weaving its way into the very fabric of society, a parasitic consciousness feeding on the city's soul.
Holmes found himself questioning the very nature of sanity, wondering if his pursuit of truth was leading him down a similar path of unraveling. In a somber moment, Holmes carefully placed the tarnished silver locket and the ancient text into a specially prepared lead-lined box, a futile attempt to contain something that seemed to defy containment, a physical manifestation of an existential dread. He looked at Watson, his eyes reflecting a newfound profound dread, a reluctant acknowledgement that some truths were too terrible to be fully understood, too dangerous to be brought entirely into the light. "This evidence," he stated, his voice heavy with the weight of their discovery, "must be sealed away, not for the sake of the living, but for the sake of the world. It is a testament to a horror that lies beyond our comprehension, a force that has perhaps always been here, waiting for its moment."
The recording, they both knew, was more than just a historical artifact. It was a warning, a glimpse into the abyss that yawned beneath the surface of everyday reality, a chilling reminder of what truly lurked in the shadows, what the city slept through after midnight. As the recording finally faded, leaving only the faint, unsettling echo of that resonant hum, a subtle visual glitch flickered across the screen, a brief distortion, as if the very act of revealing this truth had drawn unwanted attention, a fleeting glimpse of something vast and unseen that had merely stirred. The very air in the room seemed to thicken, as if the entity's presence, though distant, had been felt, a chilling resonance that suggested the story was far from over. The fragments we've uncovered have revealed a chilling truth, but the true nature of the Great Weaver and its influence remains shrouded in the deepest of London's ancient shadows. What do you believe its ultimate goal is? And what terrifying threads might it already be weaving into our own lives? Share your darkest theories in the comments below. If this descent into London's occult underbelly has chilled you to the bone, hit that like button and subscribe to Sherlock After Midnight for more unearthed secrets and forgotten horrors. The whispers from the wax are growing louder, and we are compelled to listen. Sherlock Holmes, his voice a low, grave murmur, meticulously placed the lead-lined box containing the corrupted wax cylinder and the chilling artifacts onto a sturdy oak table in the center of his study. The flickering gaslight cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the room, mirroring the unsettling images conjured by their recent investigation. The air itself felt heavy, charged with the residual energy of ancient malevolence, a palpable dread that had seeped from the very stones of Whitechapel and clung to them like the pervasive fog. Holmes's usual clean, analytical gaze was now clouded with a profound, almost weary understanding that transcended mere logic. He had painstakingly pieced together the fragmented whispers, the ancient lore, and the chilling sounds, and the conclusion he had reached was as terrifying as it was undeniable. The Ripper's bloody reign of terror, he explained to Dr. Watson, was not the work of a singular, albeit monstrous human being. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated series of ritualistic sacrifices, a macabre symphony designed to appease, or perhaps to feed, a far older, far more sinister entity, the Great Weaver. He carefully unrolled an ancient, brittle map of London, its lines faded and cracked with age. He pointed a slender finger to the heart of Whitechapel, a district that had become synonymous with terror, a nexus of the city's deepest anxieties and its most profound despair. "The Ripper," Holmes began, his voice resonating with a newfound gravity, "was merely a conduit, a pawn in a game played by an intelligence far beyond our comprehension, a cosmic puppeteer pulling the strings of human history.
This entity, this weaver, as the ancient texts describe it, manipulates the very threads of existence, feeding on human fear and despair, growing stronger with each life it unravels. The brutal efficiency and the seemingly random nature of the attacks were not the acts of a madman, but the calculated methods of a predator cultivating its prey.
By creating a climate of absolute terror, the Ripper ensured that each sacrifice was imbued with the maximum emotional potency, a rich harvest for the parasitic entity. The more people feared, the stronger the Weaver became. This was not just about murder, it was about the cultivation of terror as a spiritual, or perhaps even a physical food source for something truly alien, something that transcended the earthly realm and fed on the very essence of human emotion. Imagine your deepest, most paralyzing fear, the one that keeps you awake at night, not as a psychological quirk, but as a tangible resource for an entity that exists solely to consume and assimilate. What if the very fabric of our reality, our hopes and dreams, our deepest sorrows, are simply threads in a vast cosmic tapestry being woven by an unseen hand? He explained that the distorted sounds on the corrupted wax cylinder were not merely the screams of a victim, but the psychic imprint of the Weaver's touch, a resonance that captured the moment Eliza Croft's very essence was absorbed, her life force drawn into the entity's unfathomable consciousness. The unnatural cold she described, the spiraling symbols, and the alien chanting were all manifestations of this ancient force's presence, an otherworldly energy that could warp reality itself, a chilling reminder of its passage. The Ripper's violence, he elaborated, was a blunt instrument, a crude but effective method of generating intense, focused fear. The acts of unspeakable brutality were meticulously designed to maximize the terror, to create a concentrated surge of psychic energy that the Weaver could then draw sustenance from. The sheer horror of the mutilations, the public spectacle of the fear they generated, served to amplify the spiritual resonance, making each victim's final moments a potent offering. It was a chilling thought, Watson, that the primal terror of the human heart could be so readily harvested and repurposed by something so utterly alien. The entity was less a creature and more a fundamental aspect of reality, an inherent darkness that sought to expand and consume all light, weaving its influence into the very fabric of human society. The corruption of the cylinder, Holmes continued, gesturing towards the lead-lined box, was the entity's own signature, a mark left on the medium itself, an echo of its passage. Eliza's final moments were not an ending, but a transformation. Her life, her fear, her very soul became threads woven into the Weaver's endless tapestry. The Ripper's violence was a crude yet effective method of isolating and intensifying that fear, making the sacrifice all the more potent for this ancient parasitic consciousness. "We cannot apprehend this Weaver," Holmes stated, a grim finality in his voice, his gaze distant, fixed on some unseen horror that seemed to occupy the very air around them. "It exists beyond the physical, beyond the grasp of Scotland Yard or indeed any conventional law enforcement. To even attempt to confront it directly would be akin to a single grain of sand challenging the ocean. Its influence is woven so deeply into the tapestry of existence and perhaps even into the collective human psyche that its removal would unravel more than just the darkness, but perhaps reality itself." The texts speak of the Weaver not as a singular entity, but as a vast, interconnected consciousness, a cosmic loom upon which all reality is woven.
The Ripper, in this context, was merely one of countless weavers of dread throughout history, each contributing their dark craft to the larger tapestry. The notion of a single culprit or a simple capture was a delusion, a comforting falsehood that humanity clung to in the face of overwhelming, impersonal forces. Its power, he continued, his voice low and resonant, a tremor of something akin to awe, or perhaps dread in its tone, lies not in brute force, but in its ability to subtly alter perception, to sow discord, and to unravel the very threads of sanity and connection that bind us together. The more fragmented and fearful a society becomes, the more substantial its presence, the more it can weave its influence into the fabric of our lives. It is a predator of consciousness, a parasite of the soul. He revealed his decision to seal away the evidence, not merely as a matter of safety, but as an act of preservation of sanity. The wax cylinder, the locket, the ancient texts, they were not trophies of a solved case, but relics of a truth too terrible to be fully embraced, too dangerous to be left vulnerable. They were a testament to something that lurked in the deepest, most forgotten corners of history, a haunting reminder of forces that operated beyond human comprehension, waiting for the slightest crack in our reality to seep through. The found footage they had unearthed served as a chilling warning, a somber chronicle of something that resided in the shadows, something the city and indeed the world slept through after midnight. The case was not solved in the conventional sense of justice or retribution. It was understood, and in understanding, a profound and chilling dread settled upon them. The whispers from Eliza Croft's last moments had given them a glimpse into an ancient, all-consuming horror that no earthly power could truly defeat, only contain, and in containing, perhaps find a fragile, temporary peace. The very act of uncovering this truth felt like drawing the attention of something ancient and vast, a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of reality, a whisper of unseen attention that suggested the story was far from over. Was it possible that by merely documenting these events, they had unknowingly become part of the weaver's tapestry, their own investigations now mere threads in its grand design? The evidence, once painstakingly collected and analyzed, now felt less like a historical record and more like a living, breathing threat, its potential to infect and corrupt far greater than they could initially comprehend. The sheer weight of their discovery pressed down on Holmes and Watson, a profound existential dread that settled over them like the London fog. They had peeled back a layer of reality, glimpsing a cosmic horror that had operated in the shadows of history, using human violence as its gruesome proxy. The idea that a single, desperate pry on a wax cylinder could hold the imprint of such an ancient, pervasive malevolence was almost incomprehensible. Holmes, ever the pragmatist, even in the face of the utterly unnatural, began to consider the implications of their knowledge.
This was not a case that could be closed with a neat report for Scotland Yard. This was a truth that had to be buried, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. The lead-lined box felt like a tomb, a final resting place for a horror they could only hope to contain, not vanquish. The silver locket, cold to the touch even through gloves, seemed to pulse with a faint internal luminescence, a tiny spark of unnatural energy that whispered of forces beyond mortal ken. The dried blossom within it, a stark contrast to the oppressive decay of its surroundings, held a chilling resilience,
a subtle shift in its form suggesting an unnatural vitality that defied the very concept of time and mortality. The ancient texts, filled with cryptic warnings and accounts of rituals intended to appease or ward off such entities, were now less academic curiosities and more like maps to a dangerous, uncharted territory of existence. The very air in the study seemed to crackle with a residual energy, a subtle thrumming that echoed the sound captured on the corrupted cylinder, a constant, unnerving reminder of what they had unearthed. It was a resonance that seemed to seep into the very bone marrow, a vibration that suggested the entity's awareness had been drawn to them. Watson, usually the steady anchor to Holmes's more eccentric deductions, found himself shaken to his core. The rational explanations Holmes had initially offered now seemed laughably inadequate. He had witnessed and heard the undeniable evidence of something far older, far more sinister than a mere human killer. The profound cold Eliza Croft had described, the unsettling feeling of being watched by ancient eyes, the alien sounds that defied any earthly explanation, these were not the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but the chilling testament of a soul encountering something fundamentally other. He looked at Holmes, seeking reassurance, but saw only the same grim understanding reflected in his companion's eyes. They were no longer merely investigators. They were witnesses to a horror that transcended the boundaries of human experience. The city, with its perpetual fog and its hidden alleys, felt less like a place of human drama and more like a battleground for forces they could barely comprehend. The Ripper was a ghost of a larger threat, a human manifestation of an ancient parasitic consciousness that had been lurking in the periphery of existence for centuries, feeding on fear and despair. Holmes's hypothesis that the entity was less a singular being and more a fundamental aspect of reality, an inherent darkness seeking to expand and consume all light, was a terrifying revelation that shattered Watson's perception of the world. The corrupted wax cylinder was a tangible piece of evidence, a chilling artifact that served as a physical manifestation of this ancient, all-consuming force. Holmes carefully closed the lead-lined box, the metallic clang echoing in the charged silence of the room. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to seal away a truth too dangerous to be widely known, a reality too terrifying to be fully embraced. He recognized that their work was not about solving a crime in the conventional sense, but about understanding the nature of an ancient evil, and in doing so, perhaps finding a way to contain its influence.
The knowledge they had gained was a heavy burden, a secret that would forever mark their lives. The found footage they had unearthed was more than just a recording. It was a chronicle of a cosmic horror, a testament to something that resided in the deepest, most forgotten corners of history, something the city, and indeed the world, slept through after midnight. The Ripper, Holmes mused, was merely a shadow cast by a much larger, much older darkness, a human puppet dancing on the strings of an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The final, distorted whisper from the cylinder was not a scream, but a sigh, a breath of ancient power that seemed to linger in the very air of the study, a chilling promise that the weave of existence was far more complex and far more terrifying than any of them had ever imagined. The very act of documenting this truth felt like drawing the attention of something ancient and vast, a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of reality, a whisper of unseen attention that suggested the story was far from over. The tainted wax cylinder was now a relic, a vessel of a terrifying truth, its resonance a constant, subtle thrum that seemed to vibrate within their very souls.
The corrupted recording, with its fragmented whispers and its alien resonance, served as a stark, chilling reminder of what truly lurked in the deepest, most forgotten corners of history, what the city, and indeed the world, slept through after midnight. The case was not solved in the conventional sense of justice or retribution. It was understood in its existential scope. The Ripper was a shadow cast by a much larger, much older darkness. The final distorted whisper from the cylinder was not a scream, but a sigh, a breath of ancient power that seemed to linger in the very air of the study, a chilling promise that the weave of existence was far more complex and far more terrifying than any of them had ever imagined. What do you believe the ultimate goal of the great weaver is, and how deeply do you think its influence is already woven into our modern world, perhaps even in ways we cannot yet perceive? If this terrifying revelation about London's occult underbelly has left you with a sense of profound unease and a hunger for more of the inexplicable, please hit that like button. Subscribe to Sherlock After Midnight for more unearthed secrets and forgotten horrors, because the whispers from the wax are growing louder and we are compelled to listen.